Hey guys, Bartel's Bookshelf here with my mid-October wrap-up. I've been kind of slow usually doing these reading update videos for various reasons, but one of them was because I've been kind of struggling with a bit of a reading slump. But I guess maybe spooky season has reinvigorated me because in the last 2 weeks I've read 5 books. I think one, two, three, 5 books. So I'm feeling pretty good about that. So I usually only do these when I have like 4 books, but I've been finishing so many that I'm excited. I'm really into spooky season, and I've got sort of a mix of these are all spooky, but only a few of them are sort of directly sort of Halloween related. But we'll get into it. The first book I wanted to talk about is Blacque/Bleu by Belinda McBride. If any of you joined me for my reading sprint, you might have seen me reading this at some point. This is a gay smut novel that I found on one of my book trips with Laura and Nakia. I don't have the book with me right now because Nakia is actually borrowing it, so I'll just put up a picture for you to see. This is about a closeted werewolf named Lucas Blacque and his vampire roommate named Oliver Bleu, Black and Blue, get it? And this takes place in this town named Arcata, where all these sort of supernatural creatures kind of converge, one of whom is the werewolf pack that Lucas Blacque is a part of. And him and his vampire neighbor, Oliver Blue, have been sort of like kind of lusting after each other from afar for a while. And then one night they have an encounter, and that leads to this sort of weekend together where they sort of get to know one another and sort of fall in love. But Lucas has a lot of pack duties because his father, who's the pack leader, basically wants him to step up and be the pack leader, and part of that includes making more werewolf babies, which is difficult for him being a gay man. So he sort of struggles with that, and that's sort of the impetus for this whole plot. This was pretty good. I mean, not amazing. I mean, when it comes to like male sort of smut literature, like you kind of have to grade on a curve, at least in my experience. But I enjoyed this. It wasn't quite what I thought it was. I mean, it was sort of angsty and everything. But one of the things I liked about it, at least in sort of the first like third or first half of the book, it's very sedate and low key. Like usually in these kinds of books, they always feel the need to kind of shove in a last minute third act, sort of action scene to kind of pump everything up. But for a good majority of this book, it really is just kind of following these characters and them getting to know each other and sort of dealing with each other's sort of angsts and struggles. And we get a little bit sort of the town and of just how things work. It's very slow and kind of sedate in a way that I found very refreshing for these types of books. I was saying to Nakia, it actually reminded me a little bit, tiny bit, of that movie Weekend by Andrew Haigh. Andrew Haigh, I'm not sure how you pronounce that. But yeah, it reminded me a little bit of that in that, it's just a simple story with these two people sort of getting to know each other. And it was pretty good. The vampire is angsty, as he should be. And there's some pack politics stuff, which isn't normally my type of thing, but it's well presented enough here that it's not too intrusive. It didn't bother me too much. One of the things I thought was really interesting was that, Lucas is closeted, not because necessarily that the pack is homophobic, but the way that werewolf packs work in this universe is that they're kind of being pansexual is kind of the default. He talks a lot about how lots of werewolves kind of freely take both male and female partners. So the idea of among werewolves of kind of being solely attracted to like one gender is like very strange to them. And with him having these responsibilities of having to make babies and stuff like that, he feels like sort of a responsibility and everything. So I thought that was really interesting. That's sort of an unusual sort of angle on this type of story that you don't see very much. And it's also very interesting because Blacque, who is, a very big, tough werewolf guy, and Bleu, who's, your very sort of stereotypical, svelte, slim, sort of twinkie vampire, you would think, the vampire would be the bottom and the werewolf would be the top, but it's actually swapped. It's actually very, well, it's kind of, they're a little bit verse, I should say. But it was very interesting to see a book like this with sort of a very stereotypically masculine, sort of burly character who's, a bottom, who likes being dominated, shall we say. As for the sex scenes, obviously I can't get into details, but they're pretty good. There were a few moments where I thought they could have gone a little bit farther than they did, and there were a few moments where they sort of like jump randomly in between sort of sex scenes, and it was a little jarring. And that was my other sort of issue with this book, is that in the last half, it really does kind of fall a little bit into that trap of, a lot of male literature where, they have to like introduce, a conflict and all this stuff, and it's well done. It's a well done conflict, and it was a pretty exciting climax actually. But it kind of felt like two halves sort of stapled together, and there were a few kind of revelations in the last half that, I don't know, it kind of just didn't sit right with me. It bothered me a little bit, and sort of related to that is that I felt like while a lot of the themes that were brought up were really interesting, I don't think at the end of the day they were explored in a very sort of in-depth or satisfying way. Like, for example, the themes of homosexuality, which start out like very like interesting and sort of nuanced and like sort of an angle that I hadn't seen before, doesn't really end up having much bearing on the plot, unfortunately. And again, I don't want to spoil anything, but it's one of those things where I felt like they could have done more with it, and that wasn't the only thing. That was there was a lot of stuff in the book that I really felt like this book suffered from being a little too short. It's only about 250 pages, so I think with a little bit more expansion and proper exploration of some of these themes and these characters and kind of the way the town feels and operates and stuff, I think it could have been a lot stronger. The tightness of the story kind of sort of slowly started coming unraveled towards the end. But I mean, there was nothing wrong with it. It was all well done. The characters made sense, and honestly, like, that stuff that like doesn't normally happen in these sorts of books. At least the ones I feel like I've read a decent enough swath of these kinds of books that when something is like decent, that's like 5 stars, you know what I mean? So yeah, I enjoyed it. I thought it was cute. I thought it was, it had a little bit of darkness, going into Blue's backstory and what led to him becoming a vampire. It explored Lucas's closeted feelings really well, his emotional struggles. The characters were all likable and interesting. There were a few things that I could sort of quibble with. At times, you could also argue that, like, it's maybe a little bit too cozy in the sense that there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of conflict for them on sort of, like, an external level. But again, I mean, part of me kind of liked that it wasn't overly focused on that sort of thing. But as I say, there's a lot you could sort of talk about. But generally, I enjoyed it. It was a fun read, and I hope Nakia enjoys it. She's about a third of the way through. Then I read Darkroom Etiquette. This is by Robin Rowe. This was also based on a suggestion from Nakia, who read it, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. And she loved it. She gave it, like, a glowing review. I'll link her video in the description. And she's been trying to, like, encourage me to read this for a while. And she was saying, like, it's kind of spooky. It's not really, like, a Halloween sort of book, but it's a little bit dark. It's a little bit. It's pretty dark. It's pretty spooky. She just thought it would be, it would sort of fit the vibe. And yeah, I read this and I was shocked because this was amazing. I mean, not that I'm shocked that, Nakia is recommending a good book, because she always recommends good books. But, like, I didn't expect it to be this good. So this focuses on a kind of spoiled teen guy, a 17-year-old kid named Sayers Waite. As I say, he's sort of spoiled and everything, kind of falling in with the wrong crowd. Sort of he used to be kind of a lot sort of nerdier, and then as he's sort of gotten into high school, he's become more about like popularity and stuff like that. Typical sort of rich boy high school stuff. And then one day, after he has sort of a little meltdown and ends up getting lost, and his car runs out of gas and everything, and he gets picked up by this older guy named Caleb, who essentially kidnaps him and tries to, and he brings him to this like little hovel, sort of this locked down sort of old house with nothing but like a TV and an old child's room and some bookshelves and some VHS tapes, and is basically trying to convince Sayers that he is his long-lost son that was taken, that disappeared like 10 years ago. He's trying to convince him that sort of he was brainwashed and, he isn't who he thinks he is and all this stuff. And that's essentially the majority of the book. It's sort of an emotional struggle as Sayers is sort of trying to navigate this very tense, scary situation and sort of the trauma that develops from that. I don't want to get too much into spoilers, but there are a few things that I sort of wanted to talk about in regards to this that I guess could be considered kind of spoilery. So, but I will say this was a 5-star read. I loved it. If any of that sounds interesting to you, go check it out. But if you want to hear a little bit about why I thought it was so good, I'll talk a little bit more about it. I wasn't sure about this at first, and Nakia pointed this out, to be fair. She was saying, like, it starts out a little bit sort of like teen drama-y, and I can sort of see that. Like I understood that, the character was meant to be sort of a spoiled brat and everything, but he's kind of the way that it's presented is almost a little bit. It feels a little corny, almost like sort of a 90s high school flick, where everyone's all edgy and like pissed off and, everyone's like sniping each other. You know what I mean? Like it feels like something out of a movie. And I was like, I'm not sure about that. Like, it wasn't bad. Like, I was kind of enjoying it in, like, sort of I was imagining sort of a 90s, like, teen horror thing in my head, like Scream or The Faculty or something like that. So I was kind of enjoying it on that level. But then once it gets to the actual kidnapping and we get deep into it, I mean, like, the book really ramps up. And I thought it was just incredible. I mean, the way that Sayers has to navigate this incredibly tense and awful situation, and the emotional fallout that comes from that. Sort of the sort of mental hoops that he has to sort of force himself through in order to survive this terrible thing. And the incredible thing about that is that it's not just this story of a kidnapping. It also deals with the fallout from it, or the trauma, what happens afterward, how something so horrible being done to you can affect you as a person, years and years later, just down the line, because there's something that he points out in the book that Sayers is sort of thinking about, where he's thinking about all these movies that he's seen where, people kick in the door and the hostage is rescued, and that's where the movie ends. Well, this doesn't end there, you see what happens afterward, and how this horrible thing affects him and his relationships with people, and how he sort of, in a fucked up sort of way, learns to be sort of more empathetic and to be more and to be more sort of forgiving of himself and of other people, and to sort of look beyond, sort of his spoiled environs. It just goes places that I didn't expect a book like this to go, especially a YA book. It's not really like a graphic book, it's not really like screwed up in that sense, but in just the things that he's forced to endure, just mentally, psychologically, and the way that he's treated afterward, after everything. And the characters are so complex, some of the sort of side characters are kind of just cardboard cutouts, you could argue, but they're not really important to the story. The main sort of players in the story, I think, are really psychologically complex and deep, and they even make you feel a little bit of sympathy for the kidnapper. They make you understand this like horrible thing that he's gone through. That's one of the things I found fascinating about the book in general, is that every character in the book is dealing with trauma in some way, the effects of trauma and how and what that does to them. Some people are broken from it, some people find a way to soldier on, some people are kind of in between. And I just thought this beautifully handled all of those, differing things. And another thing that I really liked about it was that it doesn't settle on kind of any sort of simple solution to any problems, like it goes into some of the things that traumatized people can do to sort of self-medicate, outbursts and things like that, but it also talks a little bit about drugs and a little bit about religion and stuff, and it doesn't offer any of these as like a distinct answer, or it doesn't like judge him for these things that he seeks out, It was very, very complex and interesting, and I flew through this. I read this whole book in like 2 days, I think. I read half of it on the car ride to a pumpkin patch that we visited a couple weekends ago. So yeah, I was just enamored with this. As I say, I struggled with whether to give this 4 or 5 stars, because I did struggle a little bit with that opening, and I do feel like it feels so different from the rest of the book that it almost feels like 2 different things. It feels like she started out writing one book and then it turned into this other book, which, based on the author's note at the end, it kind of sounds like that's what happened. Where it was meant to be more just sort of a thriller, and then it became this complex, in-depth psychological study sort of thing. But at the end of the day, I mean, the rest of it I enjoyed so much, and I just kept thinking about it for days afterward. I mean, Nakia, I was messaging her, just sharing with her all these random thoughts I had about it, and just all these things that were running through my head, and and I was like, so, I just thought this was great, so I gave it 5 stars. I don't think I sold it very well, but I think I got everything across that I wanted to say about it. I just thought it was a beautiful book, incredibly sad, incredibly emotional, and ultimately, I think it does something very powerful in that, I think it seems to be saying that, we all need more empathy, and especially nowadays, I think that's something that I feel very strongly about, is that we have to treat people with empathy and understanding, and that's how you that's how you save people. You know what I mean? I can't go into more detail without spoilers, but I just thought it was a beautiful book. I highly recommend it. So yeah, Darkroom Etiquette by Robin Rowe. Great. Next, I have a short one. This one, obviously was for the spooky season. This is Sexual Hauntings Through the Ages by Colin Waters. I don't even remember where I found out about this. I think this was from a... it was like referenced in one of the non-fiction ghost books I read. It was either Ghostland or that Will Storr book that I hated, but this was mentioned. And I've always been fascinated with the sort of sexual aspect of ghosts, because there are lots of stories throughout history of ghosts sort of interacting with people sexually, and I've read a few sort of ghosty like smut books and things like that. So it's an aspect of hauntings that doesn't get talked about much, and it's something that I've always found very interesting. So I was like, okay, it's just a bunch of stories, of sexual hauntings. Like, let's go. Perfect for spooky season. Man, this is disappointing though. First of all, it's very, very short. It's under 200 pages, only 174 pages. There's like 45 stories in here. And they're all presented, because I think the book is trying to sort of present itself as like a legitimate take on, trying to present stories that like are real. So there's like this introduction from the author where he's talking all about, I tried to separate fact from fiction and I only picked stories that seemed the most likely to have happened. But he doesn't really cite any sources except for like a bunch of random, just a little further reading list in the back, which is basically just other collections of people's ghost stories, which is fine, I don't necessarily, I don't believe in ghosts, and I'm not necessarily expecting a book like this to prove anything, but the stories themselves were just so boring, First of all, I think because the author is, like, concerned with seeming legitimate, that, he avoids any kind of, like, romanticizing or sensationalism, and just kind of presents all the stories in a very dry, matter-of-fact, sort of very British tone, which just kind of sucks all the life out of him, ironically, for stories about ghosts. And on top of that, like, he just seems to have a really strange sense of what constitutes a sexual haunting. Like I say, like, I was expecting either, ghosts, having sexual encounters with people, or, ghosts doing sexual things, like ghosts having sex or that kind of thing. And there's a few stories like that, but, like, a lot of the time, like, half the stories in here are just, like, naked ghosts appearing to people, not even like doing anything sexual, just appearing naked, which I thought was fairly common with ghosts, I mean, we all think of, ghosts in like wispy sheets and like old clothing and stuff, but I've heard a fair few stories of just naked ghosts appearing. And like I say, like, the nakedness doesn't even necessarily have anything to do with anything sexual. It's just like usually they're appearing naked because they were murdered that way or something, It just seems like a really vague, like, not well put together book, especially because like there's a lot of just like slipshod, just sort of laziness to the editing as well. Like little things, like he was getting like dates wrong and stuff like that. Because I was curious about some of these stories. Like he talks about the Bell Witch, which I was like fairly familiar with. But he was saying it took place in the 1900s, and I was like, that doesn't sound right. And so I looked it up, and yeah, it was the 1800s. I think he just got the dates wrong, and just little things like that. And like I say, like, I wouldn't even normally focus on that sort of stuff so much, but it's like, one, the stories weren't all that interesting, so there wasn't much else to focus on, and two, he couched the whole thing with his introduction in this whole thing of like, there's so much evidence of ghosts, and we have to be legitimate, and I've only chosen stories that were the most likely to have happened. And that's the other thing, too. He says, like, I've chosen stories that are most likely to have happened. And then he has stories about, like, witches, like, breastfeeding cats and stuff like that, And it's just like, I don't know, man. It just felt like a really slipshod, sort of lazy piece of work, which is really frustrating because I love this concept. I love the concept of reading a book about sexual hauntings, But at the end of the day, like, the best thing in the book, was this Thomas Carlyle quote that he has at the end of the introduction and is recreated on the back here. Sweep away the illusion of time, compress our 60 years into 3 minutes. Are we not spirits that are shaped into a body, into an appearance, and that fade away into air and invisibility? This is no metaphor, it is a simple fact. We start out of nothingness, take figure, and are apparitions. Ghosts. There are 1,000 million walking the earth. Some 500 have vanished from it, some 500 have arisen in it, ere thy watch ticks once. We not only carry each a future ghost within him, but are, in very deed, ghosts. That whole quote is more interesting and more insightful than anything in this book, unfortunately. At least there are, you know, some little woodcut illustrations and things like that, but at the end of the day, I just thought this was really disappointing, especially because it was mentioned in one of those other nonfiction ghost books I read. So I was like, well then, fuck, you know, like, how can they draw so much from this, and I just didn't get anything out of it? But at the very least, the further reading list at the back does seem interesting. I copied it down, so maybe I'll read some more of that. I do just love ghost stories, man, but just this wasn't it, unfortunately. All right, next I have another spooky book. This is The Boy Who Wouldn't Die, The Boy Who Couldn't Die, excuse me, by William Sleator. This is just a random find at half price a few days ago. I was just, you know, as I often do, just wandering around the bookstore, just kind of seeing if anything struck my fancy. And this was on the clearance section for like $3, and I was like, okay, like I've read a little bit of William Sleator before. He wrote a book called House of Stairs that's pretty famous that I read a few years ago, and it was really weird and kind of Philip K. Dick-ish almost, you know, sort of weird bit of like YA sci-fi bizarreness, and I enjoyed it. And I've heard a bit about some of his other stuff, and it seems like that's kind of his thing. So I was like, all right, I'll give this a shot. I was really intrigued by the concept. This is basically about a kid named Ken whose best friend dies in a plane crash, and because of that, it sort of like reminds him of his own mortality. And so he decides to make a deal with this strange woman who says that she can make him invulnerable, essentially. You know, he can't be killed. All he has to do is give up his soul, of course, and, you know, she'll hang on to it and put it somewhere safe so that, you know, nobody can get to it. And it works, you know. He's invulnerable. You know, his bully tries to like beat him up, and it doesn't do anything, and all that, you know. But he decides to like test it out, and he goes to the Caribbean, you know, so that he can try and get bitten by sharks and see if that you know does anything to him. And while there, he meets this girl who's you know, part of the diving instructor, you know, sort of team. This teen girl, Sabine, that's her name, Sabine. And she basically explains that, you know, the woman who did that to him was basically an evil, a Bokor, which is like an evil version of a Houngan from voodoo mythology. And essentially that, you know, when she has his soul, she can make him kill, you know, sort of astral project him and make him kill people, you know, that are in her way and stuff. And he's having all these strange dreams about, like, murdering people and stuff. So now they have to work together to take down this evil voodoo priestess type thing. And again, this was disappointing. This was so disappointing, especially because I'd read other William Sleator books before, and this just didn't... It felt like something out from a different author, you know? First off, so it started out where I was reading it, and it was written in this very sort of detached, almost like sort of monotone kind of prose style. Very like, it reminded me a little bit of like American Psycho, you know, where it's very detached, it's very impersonal, sort of commenting sort of, you know, in a detached way on things, you know, sort of emotionally and stuff. And you know, there's all this stuff about him being sort of a spoiled rich kid and everything, and he's used to getting his way. So I was like, okay, is that kind of the point here? Like, are they purposefully writing it this way to kind of like, you know, they're getting into the head of this very like spoiled, sort of emotionally detached character, and he's going to sort of develop as it goes on? No, the whole book is just written like that. And they try to have sort of a character arc where, you know, he ends up falling in love with Sabine, and, you know, they have this like whirlwind romance, and I just didn't buy any of it, you know? There's all this stuff about how, like, when he gets his soul taken out, he, like, doesn't feel anything anymore, you know, and, like good food or whatever, you know, nothing you know, he doesn't have that spark of life anymore. He's just kind of detached. So again, I was like, is that kind of the point, you know? But then he's having all these, like, whirlwind, like, romantic feelings about Sabine, you know, and thinking about, like, oh, she's the love of my life, and, like, they just met on a vacation to the Caribbean, and, like, they get into all this, like, crazy shit, you know, while they're trying to take down this Bokor priestess lady, where, like, he ends up, like, buying her, you know, like, a plane ticket to where he lives and stuff, and they end up, you know, trying to track down his soul and everything. And I don't know, it just turns into this kind of, like, generic, like, sort of thriller. None of it really worked for me. The dream scenes were kind of interesting. They could have been kind of spooky, but again, they're just all kind of... The whole thing is just kind of there, you know? Like, stuff just sort of happens, and characters just sort of, like, have these revelations and these feelings about things and these, like, character arcs that just come out of nowhere and don't feel earned. I thought the ending was okay and kind of contextualizes some of it, but I just don't think it made up for the rest of it being so kind of generic and boring. I don't know, man. I was just really disappointed by this. Just the it was just very, I can't even like come up with much to say about it because it was just so like it followed all the kind of beats I expected it to, but it just felt so rote and like by the numbers, just going through the motions, you know. And then he's asking us to take all of these like extreme leaps in logic, which I'm not normally somebody who like freaks out about that sort of thing, but just like the lengths that he's expected us to suspend our disbelief I just thought were just ridiculous. And the rest of the book wasn't like crazy enough or exciting enough or scary enough or anything enough to like make any of that worth it, you know. So yeah, man, I was just really disappointed by this, unfortunately. But I do have a few more William Sleator books. I think that this one's a little bit more sort of like horror tinged, whereas like a lot of his other books I think are more kind of in the sci-fi range. So I might try some of his other books. I have another one called Fingers somewhere that sounds pretty interesting, and I've heard about a few of his other books that are pretty screwed up, that sound pretty screwed up. So maybe I just I didn't get the right sort of book. But man, based on like the premise and everything, like it was so disappointing. So yeah, that was unfortunate. So you had two disappointments in a row, sadly. So then I was just sort of thinking, you know, like, man, I need to actually read something Halloween themed, especially now that we're halfway through the month, you know, where, you know, the time's coming, you know. I want to read something that's actually about Halloween. And I remember this book I bought a few months ago, so I actually went digging through my boxes to find it, because that was how badly I wanted to read this thing. This is The Halloween Moon by Joseph Fink. Joseph Fink is the co-creator of Welcome to Night Vale, which I listened to a little bit back in the day, and I also read the first Night Vale book that came out like in 2016 or whatever. And to be honest, I was never like a big fan of Welcome to Night Vale. Like it was okay, but I never got into like the fandom or anything like that. I thought it was a bit overrated, honestly. I thought it was sort of a dime store surrealism, boil in the bag weirdness, you know, for people who had no experience with anything like that before, you know. And it was okay, but nothing special. I felt the same way about the book. But I really enjoyed this. This is a middle grade book about this girl named Esther Gold who's obsessed with Halloween. Like it's all she ever thinks about, all she ever cares about. She's so devoted. She has 3 costumes for Halloween. She has one for school, one for trick or treating, and one that's like a backup in case the other ones don't work out. And as usual, she's excited to go trick or treating again this year. But she's 13. She's getting ready to go into high school, and her parents are sort of kind of forbid her from going trick-or-treating. They're like, you're getting too old, you need to focus on something else, blah, 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 blah. So, of course, she decides to ignore them and go trick-or-treating anyway with her guy friend, Augustine. And on Halloween night, something strange happens where, the moon comes out and it's this big, giant orange disc in the sky, and everything's sort of dark and spooky, and everything's not quite right. And there are these guys in these mysterious, like, sort of ice cream trucks, selling candy apples and pumpkins and things, and then they just seem a bit weird, and there's these trick-or-treaters walking around in these like dirty costumes making these strange insectoid clicking noises, and they basically have to figure out what's going on. And it turns out that this woman, the queen of Halloween, has basically trapped her town in this little bubble where it's Halloween forever, and so she has to work with her friend Augustine, her bully, and this dentist who lives next door to her. They have to kind of work together to stop this. And this was a really cute, fun book. It really tapped into a lot of that sort of Ray Bradbury-esque, like sort of October moon sort of descriptions, of like the orange moon and the fog and the trees and that kind of thing. And it was really sort of creepy at times as well, like the trick-or-treater things that are working for the queen. As I say, they're implied to be these like strange sort of eldritch insectoid creatures and stuff, and that was all like really fun. The thing that surprised me about it was how it delves into some slightly deeper themes than you would expect. Like it talks about growing old and sort of the fear of growing old, and how Esther is kind of like looking back at her life and sort of seeing how things are starting to change and how she's kind of rebelling against that. There's a lot of stuff about sort of the love of Halloween and why people love it, and why it's so important, that I really resonated with. And there's some interesting sort of wrinkles to the characters that I really liked, where she a big sort of theme of the book is that she sort of is learning how people are more than they first appear. Her bully isn't just a bully. Her dentist isn't just a dentist. There's multitudes to people. So yeah, it was all pretty fun. I do think that it could have been a little more, just more in general. Like it could have been a little more spooky, a little more atmospheric. It could have like pushed it a little over, that kept it from being like a 5-star read for me. But for the mood that I was in, where I just wanted something spooky and sort of Halloween-y, that, and sort of going into, sort of the feelings of Halloween and everything, I thought this was pretty well done. And it got me, honestly, like it hit me in the feels a little bit, thinking about my own experiences as a kid, and when change comes, you lose things, but you gain things, and yet at the same time, like some part of you always wants to go back to that sort of childhood love, and just that new, fresh innocence, the excitement of being a kid on Halloween, I really felt that, and I thought it was pretty well done. So yeah, I enjoyed that. I don't think it was incredible or anything, not a masterpiece, but as I say, for the mood that I was in, I enjoyed it. I would recommend it if you're looking for sort of a spooky children's Halloween read. So yeah, it was good to end on something more positive and something, for the spooky season. So yeah, those are my reads. As I say, I went through a lot of books in the last couple of weeks, so I apologize if I kind of sped through some of these. But I hope you enjoyed. And I'm still reading spooky Halloween stuff. I've got some other sort of Halloween books that I'm going to be talking about. Also, Aaron and I are still planning our Bartell's Bloodbath stream. That's happening on Saturday, the 25th. So just watch out for that. So yeah, until then, I hope everybody's having a great spooky season, and I hope everyone's actual Halloween is amazing and everyone has a great time. And yeah, so stay spooky, and I'll see you guys later. Bye.